building. So if you haven't seen it, organizing and volunteering across the globe. Ed, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Well, thank you, Renee, all of you for coming. I'll give you just a brief background starting at my birth. No, I don't think I'll start there. I've been doing beekeeping since the early 1970s, where I started in France. I was living in a 400-year-old house at the time and found bees on the property that I had bought, and ended up going to school there. I had already gotten a degree in California, but I went to school in France to learn beekeeping. Since then, I became the Apiary Specialist for the state of Arkansas, and then started doing consulting overseas in developing countries. In fact, I did a program today in Tunisia. I wasn't there, obviously, it was on Zoom. But I've been very lucky with my career as a beekeeper. It's been a lot of fun. I've done a lot of different things. As a consultant and apiary specialist, I've taught a lot of classes and met a lot of beekeepers, learned a lot of different techniques, and then as my consulting overseas, saw a bunch of different things. My last overseas trip was just before the pandemic. I went to Madagascar. So since the pandemic, I've done 4 more in Madagascar remotely, 1 in Morocco and now 1 in Tunisia. So I'm keeping busy. I've been in more than 40 countries. Yeah, that's much better. More than 40 countries working with bees, and I've been in more than 130 countries altogether. So I've been very privileged to be able to meet so many fine people that are keeping bees. I call it a noble profession because they're helping make food for everybody. So today I want to talk about bees, not so much about beekeeping. There's a lot of things that people don't know about bees. I just met a girl out in the entranceway. She said that she knew 2 facts about bees, and I said, what are they? And she said, when bees sting, they die. And I said, and what's the other one? And she said, I don't remember. but she still likes bees. She just doesn't want to be stung. This program, I've done a similar program to this for master gardeners. And Renee also mentioned that I'm a master beekeeper, which is a program that I went through with the Eastern Apicultural Society. It was born out of the master's program at Cornell University. But it was mainly just, for me, it was mainly just taking tests. I didn't have to take a course. So Bees 101 at the Fayetteville Public Library today, presented by me. In coming in the room, this nice lady here asked me if we were going to be talking about other species, native species of honeybees. There's actually 20,000 different species of bees in the world, not to mention wasps and hornets, which are also often confused as being bees. If somebody gets stung by a wasp or a yellow jacket, they usually blame it on bees, but they are not bees. About 4,000 of those are in the United States. And like honeybees, they're in trouble. Like a lot of our environment, they're in trouble. Most of those bees are solitary, but most of them are also beneficial. All of them are fascinating, and some of them are absolutely beautiful. But when we think of bees, we think of honeybees, and that's what I'm going to be talking about. Fossils have indicated that bees came to be around 65 million years ago, but recent DNA studies indicate that bees developed nearly 130 million years ago, very shortly after the first flowers appeared on Earth. So it was sort of a coincidence and sort of not a coincidence, but the flowers needed bees and the bees needed the flowers. And so they have a symbiotic relationship that is extremely important to them and to the flowers and therefore to us. What the public should know about honeybees. I want to talk to you about general information about honeybees, their importance, both their direct value and their indirect value, their risks and their problems, and what you can do to help. And that's important, and that's that thing about what you can do to help is what I really want you to come away with. How many of you have honeybees now? Boy, that whole family does, and a few of you do. I'm going to stick a little advertisement in here. Next Monday night, which is the 14th, the Northwest Arkansas Beekeepers Association has their monthly meeting at the county extension office, and you're all invited to come. Whether you join or not is irrelevant, but if you join, it's going to cost you a total of $15 a year, and we have good programs planned for the next year. And if you join as a family, it would be a bargain because it's $20 for the whole family. If we charged them a piece, it would be a lot. So first of all, I want to talk about where bees come from. Picture of the globe. There are several different races of honeybees, and they can be grouped from 3 main continents, with species and subspecies coming from those continents. There's a lot of different subspecies, and then there's hybrids of the subspecies. We're going to talk a little bit about Asia. There's 4 species there. There's actually 5 there because they've imported our western honeybee. I've been lucky enough to see all 5 of the species in South Asia. One of them I had to hike for 4.5 days to see it, the cliff bees that are way up in the Himalayas. The European bees, there's a lot of subspecies and hybrids coming from Europe. And the African bees. And the African bees, it's thought, are what populated Europe long, long ago. So they went from Africa to Europe. The European bees were imported into North America and South America. There were no native honeybees on these 2 continents. The Pilgrims brought them. And the Indians, the Native Americans, when they saw the bees, they knew that the Pilgrims weren't far behind, and they called them white man's fly. Then, back in the 1950s, bees were brought from the southern part of Africa, not South Africa necessarily, to Brazil. And those were African bees that were imported because the bees that the Pilgrims brought to Brazil didn't do well in tropical areas, so they wanted to bring some more tropical adjusted bees there to interbreed with the Brazilian bees, but then by accident they got away, and they spread and they hybridized with the western bee, and we got what we now call the Africanized bee, which has come into even southern Arkansas. Well, beekeeping itself started a long time ago. This is a cave painting that I was lucky enough to see before they closed that cave to people. But it's a painting on a wall in a cave from 7,000 years ago. It was actually a honey gatherer or a honey hunter. So it started in the old world. It started around 7,000 BC. The hunting and gathering customs of the times. And until maybe 15, 20 years ago, I thought that was something that happened a long time ago. But then I got invited to Bangladesh to work in the jungle of the Sundarban because they have a bee that was dying pretty rapidly because of the honey hunters. They were killing the bee when they were harvesting the honey because they didn't know that they were cutting down the brood at the same time as cutting down the honey. There was 4,000 honey hunters in this jungle. They're called moalis, and this is just one of them. When I was there the first time, the big danger in that jungle were the tigers. And they didn't want me to go into the jungle, they just wanted me to teach them. But I was able to go into the jungle. Modern beekeeping has changed things a lot. We have hives like this one that's standing over here that we have movable frames. We can work with the bees. We can see how the queen's doing. We can look for diseases and other maladies. And we can have them at our house or wherever we want to have them for pollinating crops or for gathering honey, whatever we're having them for. So it's more like gardening as compared to hunting and gathering. Because in the old days, if you wanted honey, you had to go find it in the tree someplace. But now we can grow it right in our backyard. Things have changed over the last, probably close to 100 years. Started in California, migratory beekeeping. And in California, it's very, very big business now because the almonds cannot make a single almond without honeybees. They flower in February, and there aren't other insects around to pollinate them. And so about in between a third and half of all the bees in the United States to California to pollinate the almonds. That also becomes a problem because they swap diseases and pests and things. So when I was apiary specialist, that was a big job in controlling problems that were coming from California. They were also, because of the demand there, they were also importing bees from Australia, and they were talking about importing bees from Mexico. But we were able to stop both of those because of the diseases that they have that we don't have. The colony of bees is a family. And when we talk about hives, a hive is just a cavity or a box where the bees live. But the colony is the family that are living in that box, or across the street over here at the watermelon house. I don't know if you know that house. There's a tree there with bees living inside of it. That's a colony. The tree isn't a hive, but you could say the cavity in that tree is basically a hive. The colony works as a unit to promote the continuance of its family and species. We all do that. We don't think about it that way, but why do we have kids? To continue our genetics and our species. Why do plants make seed? To continue their genetics and their species. Why do vegetables make fruit? To feed the seeds so they can continue their species and their genetics. This all requires propagation. They need to multiply. And I sort of divide that into two different things. The raising young bees I call micropropagation, and the swarming of the bees is macropropagation. Now, when we talk about swarming, that's when some portion of the colony gets up and leaves and goes to find another place to start another family. And we can relate to that too, because I did that, my son did that, your kids did that, or you did it. We all leave and start a family someplace else. For bees, when we think how they think, which we really don't know how they think, they're sort of diversifying the location of their genetics so that if there's a fire, for example, maybe one of them might burn, but the family's going to continue someplace else. Or if there's not enough food around, not enough flowers with nectar, still thinking about it, and he swarmed a long time ago. They have different jobs, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's a swarm. So that's the micro and the macro propagation. The family members of the colony are different than ours. There's a queen, one queen normally in a colony. Sometimes there might be more, but almost always she is just an egg factory. She lays between 1,500 and 2,000 eggs every day, more than her body weight. And those eggs develop over a period of 21 days for the workers to become adult bees. The second one is the worker bee. That's what most of the bees are in the colony. They're incomplete females. The queen is a complete female. Her reproductive system is totally developed, whereas the workers, their reproductive system isn't totally developed. So they can lay eggs under certain conditions, but those eggs will never become anything. And then there's drones. Drones are the males in the hive. Mainly, they just are there to fertilize the queen when she needs to be fertilized, which is just at the beginning of her life. In fact, today I put out 30 queens into separate little boxes so they can go out and mate with the drones that are in the area. The tasks by the ages, the colony is extremely organized. It's a society that is phenomenal, unlike ours sometimes. While the honeybee only lives from 30 to 42 days, we like to think that they live 42 days, but things happen to them. Its life is systematic chores based on the development of and the needs of the colony. So like our children, when they're little, they can't do much very productive. They eat and they sleep. And when they get older, they can maybe do a few things, you know, like bring me that fork or something like that, but they can't carry a bucket of water. But when they get bigger, they can carry a bucket of water, but they don't want to carry the fork anymore. So bees are sort of like that. They develop different abilities, mainly depending on the glands in their body developing and then atrophying to where they can't do that job anymore and they move on to the next job. So there's that bee that's hatching out, and there's some bees working in the colony. Actually, that's a picture of one bee coming from the field and giving honey to another bee that's working in the house to store the honey and to add enzymes to it. It's actually passing nectar and then adding enzymes to it to make it into honey. That's an older bee from 9 to 12 days old that has glands on its abdomen that's able to produce wax. That's where beeswax comes from. And those same bees at that age are able to manipulate that wax to build perfect little hexagons for the queen to lay eggs in and for them to store honey in. These are guard bees that are acting like a cat when it's upset about something. They make themselves look big and stuff and sort of hunch up. And they could also be cooling the hive, blowing the air out of the hive. The bees have to keep the temperature of the brood area where the nursery is at a certain temperature all the time, between 93 and 95 degrees. Today it was almost 95 outside and they were in the sun, and there's thousands of them in a box like that. It gets hot in there, so they're bringing in water. They're dispersing the water around the hive, and then in the hive the bees are making a pattern, blowing their wings and blowing that honey or that water out of the hive to air condition the hive to get it down to the right temperature. There's the bees transferring nectar again. And then the last part of their life, they go out and they forage and they work themselves to death, basically. So the bees that you see out on flowers or flying around, those are older bees. About the last third, or 10 to 14 days, is actually spent in the field collecting nectar, pollen, water, and propolis. Propolis is glue that they make to fix things in the hive to not move, but it's also a natural antibiotic that they use to fight diseases and stuff. It also works for people, by the way. So how do bees communicate? How do they know what they need to do? Well, we know that they do two different things. What's one thing you know that bees do to communicate? Dance. So if somebody went out right now and they found something to eat and they came in here, boy, that looks good. What is it? use the pheromones. The pheromones are like hormones. Hormones are things in our body that tell our body to do something. Are chemicals in a body that tells other bodies to do something. They smell those pheromones. They smell with their antenna. And then they do the dances. So there's a picture of a queen with a bunch of bees around her. They're grooming her with their antenna, so they're smelling her. They're picking up the scent of that queen. The scent of the queen is one of the many pheromones that they use and one of the many that the queen has. It identifies the bees in the colony. Because they live in a tight place, they're all rubbing against each other, and they all pick up the smell from that queen. There's a bee doing a dance, and you can't see it moving because it's not a movie, but you can see its hind leg there. Let's see if there's pollen. They have little pollen baskets on their hind leg with little brushes that they can take the pollen and make it into a little ball and carry the pollen back to the hive. These bees here are smelling the pollen. She probably has nectar too, and she's doing a dance telling them where to go get this. So I don't have a picture of the dance. Basically, the dance, let's say that the hive is over there, and that window or the projector in the back is the sun, and in between the hive and the sun, the combs are vertical, is doing a where you're going to find this flower. And the intensity of that wiggle part, it's called the wagtail, is telling them how far it is. So if it was the opposite direction, it would be down. If it was off to the right, it would be off to the right. It's pretty simple, and beekeepers can actually see this happening and know where they're going. And they do that for swarms too. When a swarm goes someplace, then the scouts go out and find places for a permanent location, and they come back and they do a dance telling the bees where they found something, and the one that dances the best gets them to convinced to go that way. Yes?
Do they understand that the sun moves?
They understand the sun moves, and they see that because they have big eyes that we see easily has multifaceted. So a combination of the ultraviolet and the multifaceted part of the big eye, they see the sky in spectrums. So the sun is even on a cloudy day. So the direct value, we think, is mainly honey. And my numbers on this presentation are quite old, some of them from 1999. But approximately $200 million worth of honey is produced annually in the United States. We're an importer country. We import a lot of honey, but 200 million is produced in the United States. On top of that, we have products of value that are consumed. So say $250 million is produced by the bees. Their indirect value, and this was based on a study, and again, it's a long time ago, it's over 18 billion now. USDA and Cornell University estimated $14.6 billion of our agricultural product are a result of honeybee pollination. That's about 50 times more than the honey that they produce. So 50 times what the beekeepers are getting for honey, the bees are doing for all of us. This means that we can basically thank bees for 1 out of 3 of our bites, because it's about 1/3 of the agricultural product that bees are responsible for. They help things to the very obvious to the very less obvious, from cucumbers to ice cream. I've given talks to kids several times in schools and stuff, And I often ask the kids, what kind of product do you think that the bees, a food product that you think bees don't help? And of course, somebody always says ice cream. And that's not true. Because to make good ice cream, you need good milk. And to have good milk, the cows need to eat clover and alfalfa and good food with lots of protein. And the bees make a lot of that possible. Now, I did have a kid that said water, and I can't really say that bees directly help or indirectly help water, but they probably do. In Bangladesh, I convinced the forester that was working there that he was very concerned about poachers killing their tigers. And I told him that honeybees help feed the tigers. And I explained the whole chain of how they do. So that's a picture of a bee that's going into a flower. They have hair on their bodies. It has an electrostatic charge, sort of like socks with sheets in the dryer. And the pollen sticks to the bee, and then some of it falls off on other parts of the flower and on other flowers of the same species. That's a family that's a family as big as yours, thanking the bees for every third bite. This is a picture in Whole Foods, not local, but it was probably in Austin, where their headquarters are. This is what the market looks like with honeybees, the produce part. And this is what it looks like if there were no honeybees. A friend of mine that gives a lot of talks likes to say that without honeybees, we would be eating gruel, which means grains and more grains and more grains. We wouldn't have a lot of our fruits. We wouldn't have any nuts. We wouldn't have a lot of things. In Arkansas, and again, this is 1999 figures. I haven't worked on it since then. It was calculated that the bees add about $654 million to the agricultural product. Their indirect value doesn't even consider what they do for the environment. And they do a lot. Clearly enhance the seed, nut, and wild berry production, which feeds much of our wildlife and tigers. So these guys are all benefiting from honeybees. What's the value for those who grow our food? It's priceless. Farmers, fruit growers, and gardeners have to do a lot of things. They have to take care of their soil. They have to tend to the seeds or stock that they're choosing. They have to manage the moisture. They have to deal with the diseases and pests. But if they do all that and they don't take care of their beneficial insects, it's going to be for naught. So when farmers are out there spraying their pesticides and doing monoculture, that means that there's one crop there that's going to give the bees food, but afterwards it's a desert for the bees. They're not doing themselves any favors. Pollination is the mating of flowers to create offspring in order to continue its species. The tools that pollinate are wind for some crops like corn. Corn is sort of unique. It has the male flower up high and the female flowers are down lower, and they both flower at the same time. So a little bit of wind will knock the pollen down onto the female flowers. Birds do some pollination. Other insects do some pollination, including other bees. But honeybees are the most efficient insect because their pollination, because of their numbers. For example, in a hive like this with a couple more boxes on top of it, there'll be 60 to 70,000 bees in it. So a third of those are out pollinating all the time. Their organization, honeybees are one of the only insects that is, I can't think of what the word is, but it is obligated to stay with one crop at a time. So you might have, say you have 3 hives, they might be pollinating different things, but each colony is pollinating one thing. So when it's moving pollen from flower to flower, it's staying within a species. Whereas other insects don't do that. They go from one flower to another. Their transportability is important because, for example, like the pollination of the almonds, bees have to be sent from all the way from Florida and Maine and quite a bit from Arkansas to Northern California to pollinate the almonds. Almost 80% of all the almonds in the world are grown in California. It's about a $3 billion business. There would not be any almonds in the world at all if it wasn't for honeybees. So there's some bees in the almond groves. How does it work? A flower makes itself attractive at its time of need. And you all thought that flowers were pretty for us. That reminds me of the song. You thought this song was about you. They make themselves pretty to attract pollinators. Their color, their shape, and it becomes a bartering system. They give directions to find the pollen where they need to be touched to move the pollen from one part of the flower to another part of the flower, or from that flower to another flower. Those directions are shown with that ultraviolet vision that the bees have. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. The bees find the flower attractive, and they enter to reap the bounty of nectar or pollen. In doing so, the bee moves pollen from the male parts to the female parts of the flower or to other flowers of the same species. So this is just a diagram of a simple flower showing the male parts and the female parts and where the seeds are produced and how the flower continues its species. And this picture shows how the bees help. It's a transaction with advertisements. This is a picture of a flower with ultraviolet lens on it, and it's actually giving arrows to where they want the bees to enter. Does it look familiar at all to you? Because we have that too. This is a restaurant telling you how to get into the store to spend some money in exchange for some food. Very similar. Honeybees are our best pollinators. They affect most of our food supply, from apples to zucchini. That's apple trees. That's zucchini. And yet, a lot of work is needed to combat the critical problems facing our honeybees. On average, in a tax year, each person that pays taxes, and we're learning that a lot of people aren't, pays 2 cents, not 2 cents on the dollar, pays 2 cents for the research to save honeybees. My wife said one time that she would double hers. I said, if you can convince everybody to do that, that would help. Does it really make a difference? Have you ever had an apple that had hardly any flavor? Ever grown a wasp-wasted squash, you know, where you had some squash here and then it became small in the middle and became big again, or it tailed off to nothing? That's lack of pollination. Each seed needs to be pollinated, seed to develop. And if a fruit is going to grow, the reason it's growing is to feed the seed, not to feed you. So if you cut an apple in half, there's a bunch of seeds in there. If it has a big dimple on one side because it wasn't pollinated for that seed on that side. And the same thing is true with zucchini. Cucumbers, you can't get cucumbers without pollination. Seen misshapen strawberries? Same thing. Cucumber flowers, but no cucumbers. There's strawberry flowers. There's a strawberry, and you can see the seeds on strawberries. There's some that are not pollinated. You can see it right there, and some that are. So for each seed, they need a pollinator to come to visit it for the development of each seed. Honeybees have lots of problems. They have diseases that include bacterial, viral, protozoal, fungal, and parasitic, just like us. Humans also cause problems. They have phobias, financial problems, reduced forage, and pesticides. The parasites have been a big problem for honeybees of late. The tracheal mites came into the United States from the Isle of Wight, where they were first found. They came to the United States in the early 1980s. They wiped out about 80% of all the wild honeybees in the woods. And they killed a lot of honeybees that beekeepers were keeping. A few years later, we got the varroa mite. That was in 1986, I think, in Arkansas. It's still a problem, and it has become more of a problem than we ever realized it was. It's either awakening viruses that were sleeping giants, or it's importing viruses, but it's causing a lot of viruses. We got the small hive beetle several years later from Africa. The world's getting smaller, transport is being easier, and things are getting moved all over the world. Today, when I was talking to people in Tunisia, they were talking about importing bees from Italy. And I said, don't do it. I was in Egypt a few years ago. They never had a disease, a bacterial disease that we call foul brood. They never had it in Egypt. In fact, some of the Egyptians came to Arkansas to visit with me to learn about foul brood. They'd never seen it. When I went to Egypt a few years ago, they were wiped out with foul brood, and I found out that they imported bees from Europe. Another headache, Africanized honeybee that I mentioned that hybrided in Brazil and then came up through South America, Central America and Mexico into the United States. It got to Brazil in the 50s, got to Texas in 1990, got to Oklahoma in 2004, and I found it in Arkansas in 2005. And the last report, it's in 8 counties in Arkansas. I'm not going to get into what it means, but basically it's a very defensive bee. It protects its colony viciously. The latest headache, and some of you might have heard of this, is colony collapse disorder. And it's sort of gotten itself under control, but it's caused a lot of speculation as to cause, and also a lot of speculation as to the importance of honeybees. So there's good things and bad things. There was all kinds of speculation what caused it, all the way from the rapture to cell phones. And I won't even get into that. I met the guys that wrote a scientific paper about cell phones hurting honeybees. But mainly pathogens that are coming from the varroa mite, pesticides. These things that are written in bigger letters are probably more the cause than things written in small letters are not. They're speculations that came out. But one thing, well, nutrition is there. And that's been a really big problem. Like I said, agriculture has gone to huge monoculture fields where you'll have thousands of acres of one crop. And when that crop's not flowering, it's just a desert. And to make it easy for the farmer, they've cut down all the hedgerows, so there aren't wildflowers in between for bees to nest or to feed or anything. So I sort of broke it down into 3 categories of concern: pathogens, new and old from parasites and new introductions, or immune deficiency, which the mites are causing an immune deficiency disorder in the bees. Environment, which includes pesticides, herbicides, GMOs, and other pollutants, nutrition, and climate change. Managerial, residues that beekeepers are using to kill the parasites, the parasitic infestations that they're picking up when they go to places like the almond groves. Nutrition, if they're taking too much food and then feeding their bees something that's not that good for them. And the genetic pool has gotten smaller and smaller. We have queen breeders that are the genetic pool is just getting narrow. All those things equal stress, and that's what's caused the colony collapse. Human problems also besiege bees, and I call it the 4 Fs. Here I am in the library saying phobia is an F. Financials, foraging, and another F, pharmaceuticals. So those are problems that people have put on bees. The phobias are undue fear. Bees don't want to sting you. They die when they sting you. They only sting when they think you're going to hurt them. And a lot of people will say that they're allergic to bees, but it's less than 0.5% of the population that's actually could have an allergic reaction. Swelling is normal, just like you're not allergic to poison ivy because it itches. Financial is both the beekeepers and the researchers. Beekeepers for a long time weren't making enough money to make it worthwhile. Now they're making more money actually doing pollination contracts than selling honey. Foraging we talked about, and part of that is urban sprawl. And the pharmaceuticals are small people in the city and gardeners and farmers using different types of pesticides. So we've got to find a way through these problems. Honeybees are like flying dust mops. They fly through the air, they have the static electric charge, and everything sticks to them. If you want to know what's going on in the environment, look inside of a beehive and test it for chemicals. A team of entomologists and a chemist at Penn State University did a bunch of that. And they found 43 different pesticides and 5 bolix in the wax and stored pollen in hives. 43 different pesticides. 8 pyrethroids, 4 organophosphates, 4 carbamates, 3 neonicotinoids, which is a new one I'll talk about in a minute, 2 insect growth regulators, 2 organochlorines, 2 chlorinated cyclodine, 13 different fungicides, 6 herbicides, and 14 of these were systemic. Systemic means that you can treat the ground or treat the seed, and the poison is going to go through the plant. It's going to be in the nectar, it's going to be in the pollen, and it's going to be forever. And if something eats that nectar or eats that pollen, they've got it too. The lady that did the presentation that ran this study at Penn State University is a really sweet lady. And I just sat there with a smile on her face watching her so kindly giving this presentation. And afterwards I realized I should be really depressed. The fourth F, excuse me, library, are the pharmaceuticals, misuse of insecticides, fungicides, and overuse of herbicides. Herbicides, briefly, unnecessary eradication of weeds. Weeds are flowers too, and we need to weed sometimes to make our garden look nice. But we don't need to get rid of all the polka dots on the lawn. Some of you are wearing stripes and plaids and patterns on your shirts, and I wore a pattern today on purpose because I don't want a green lawn. I want a lawn that has yellow flowers and white flowers and even some pink and purple flowers. I've dug up half my lawn to put in flowers. Insecticides, well, basically honeybees are insects, and there's so many different insecticides out there. This poor lady, I don't know who she is, and I hope nobody's related. Spraying flowers in the middle of the day during the flowering. She's killing insects. She could do differently. She could spray before the flowers or after the flowers when they're gone, and she won't kill near as many beneficial insects. She can do it early in the morning or late in the evening so that the insects that would be out pollinating aren't on the flowers when she's spraying them. And I don't know what she's spraying right there, but I would imagine it's a broad spectrum insecticide because, and I'm saying bad things about this lady that I don't know, most people are not conscious of what it is that's bothering their plants. So they go to the store and they buy a broad spectrum insecticide that just kills all of the insects instead of what it is that you want to save and targeting that pest. And every time you do that, every time you go to the big box store or to the garden store or something and you buy a broad spectrum insecticide, they're going to make fewer and fewer specific insecticides and sell a lot more of that broad spectrum one. So every time we go to the store to buy something like that, we're voting with our dollars what we want them to make. Minimizing the effects of insecticide. Number one, don't do it blindly. Know what your target pest is and aim at that target pest. Number two, use low hazard formulations. Try to find what is least dangerous to beneficial insects. Next, think about residual action. Some insecticides only kill on contact and then they dissipate. Some stay there forever, like systemic insecticides. And then number four, I think we're at, do it in the late evening or early morning when the insects are sleeping. You can get a chart of relative toxicity. You can aim at your target pest. You can consider formulas that are less toxic to honeybees. You can consider alternative insecticides. You can advocate for agricultural methods, and you can advocate for the protection of beneficial insects. Those are all things you can do, and it sounds like a lot, but some of it's very simple. And I'll give you another simple one in a minute. There's also some pesticides that are alternatives. So, for example, beer will kill slugs. Borax will kill ants. Peppers will keep a lot of insects off of your plants, hot peppers. Herbs, different herbs living on Earth will give you different use that will chase away pests. For example, using peppermint or tansy for ants. And it's not going to hurt anything else. People complain sometimes that their hummingbird feeders are attracting bees and that's keeping the hummingbirds away. Put a little bit of almond oil in that hummingbird water and the bees won't come. And it won't hurt anybody. White flour will keep moths off of cabbage. We can go on and on and on. What can you do for honeybees? Be their advocates. Know how important they are and tell your neighbors how important they are. And then educate people about their importance, educate people about alternatives to their destruction, help to make better environments, plant things that will attract them, vote with your dollars, and become a beekeeper. That is a possibility. This family over here is going to be, they're new beekeepers, and their kids will be beekeepers someday. And by the way, at the Northwest Arkansas Beekeepers Association, historically, we just had a big pesticides, they'll say very toxic to honeybees, moderately toxic, or non-toxic. But they've only tested it on adult honeybees. They don't think about what those honeybees are carrying it back and feeding it to their babies. What happens to the sublethal levels are not taken into consideration. You know, moderately, they put jar that's coated on the inside with an insecticide and see how many of them live. Well, the ones that live may not live very long, or may become defective, or may be poisoned with a neurotoxin like a neonicotinoid and not be able to find its way home. Newer classes of pesticides are neurotoxins, inhibiting learning and memory. This is what brood looks like in a beehive. I can't tell, there's not any eggs there actually. The eggs hatch on the third day, and these tiny larvae, the smallest ones like that one, is on its fourth day. It's being fed every day. The first few days it's being fed royal jelly, which is a glandular secretion, and then on the 5th day, its diet changes to nectar and pollen. But what's that laced with, we don't know. So you need bees. You can own them. They're interesting. They're fun. They require some commitment, but not terribly amount. They're not to take care of, but there is a learning curve. They give a lot of pleasure and wonderful products in pollination. You can plant for them. If you don't want to be a beekeeper, you can still plant for them. Plant with native things because they'll survive best here. Plant things that pollinators love. Avoid pesticides in plants that have been treated systematically. And that's happening a lot. If you go to some of the big box stores and ask the people that are working in the nursery department, have they used neurotoxins on these plants? They don't have a clue what you're talking about, but most of them have been. So you need bees, you need to know their value, and you need to advocate for their protection. I didn't wear a tie. If there's any please. I'm better at fielding questions than just talking. Come on. Yeah, 2 hands right here.
So I just got these at the beginning of May
Uh-huh.
and had a nuke,
Uh-huh.
and I just checked them yesterday. And I don't know when to put my second box on top. Can you guide me on that?
I can guide you. Before I guide you, I have to do a precursor. If you get 15 beekeepers together and ask them a question like that, you're going to get 17 answers.
That's why I'm doing.
Join a bee association and get a mentor is my first advice. As far as specifically with your question, the hives that are out on the roof right now are in single boxes like this. I like the bees to fill out all the frames, and I move the frames. I take the outside frames that they're not using and I slowly move them into the inside to encourage the queen to lay on them. I want that bottom box to be almost all brood, just a little bit of honey and pollen on the sides. When that's almost full, then you can start putting what's called supers on top of it. And those supers are usually more shallow boxes, so the frames aren't so heavy and they're easier to extract. And again, I like those filled before I put a second one on.
What happens if you jump the gun a little bit and put that super on before it's fully filled in the first spot?
What happens when you walk past the kitchen and there's a few dishes that need washing? You wash them. But when there's a big stack, you didn't see it. So I sort of think, you know, you can put more than one on. I've got a whole presentation on how to put supers on and stuff. It's going to take a while, especially if it's just foundation, for the bees to even go into it. And if you can get some old comb from somebody else, trade some new foundation for some old comb, put those in every other one or something, that will get the bees up there faster. Once you have that one starting to be filled pretty well, then when you put the second one on, you can either put it under the one that they're already working, so they have to go through it to get to the other one. Or even better, you can do what's called baiting the super, taking some of the honey from this one, putting it in this one, and putting some empty frames down here. They'll fill out those empty frames and they're already working up here. Yes?
Are there any books about bees that you recommend reading? What are your favorites?
There's a whole bunch over there. There's that area that's becoming the beekeeping area of the library, and there's several books there, and there's other books in the library, I'm sure. Depends on what level you want to be reading on. Backyard Beekeeper is a good one by Kim Flodham. His ex-wife wrote a book called Beekeeper's Handbook, and it's excellent. I used to use it for teaching.
Are there any about like bee biology and like not so much about beekeeping, but just about how they work?
About the biology. Tom Seeley, and they have the book that he does called Bee Democracy. It talks a lot about how bees communicate and stuff like that. By A.I. Root. That's basically an encyclopedia, and it gets into biology. There's also Beekeeper's Bible. There, in one library, University of California, Davis, there's, gosh, in 1982, there were 1,600 volumes. So I spent a long time in that library.
Are there any that you return to yourself that you like the most of all, like your little Bible of bees?
Well, I'm sort of past Tom Seeley's book, Bee Democracy, but I like Diana Salmatero's book, Beekeeper's Handbook, also. It's both basic and it explains things well. Yes?
I want to become a beekeeper, and we have dogs. Would I want to keep them away from the beehives? Or
Dogs will be curious about your bees, and they'll stick their nose in there one time. Because their nose is black, and bees don't like black because it looks hot to them. And they'll get stung on the nose. And when I kept bees in Mountain View, there was a pond next door. And my dog, every time I just got my veil or lit my smoker, my dog. So she learned real fast. There was a hand back there someplace.
Mine was the flowers. What particular, like I have a planted clover to try to help, but what other species of flowers, native that you're talking about?
Gosh, there's lists and lists and lists about flowers. I think one of the library books talks about flowers. I can't remember the name of it though. There's so many. My wife and I are competing for garden space right now because she's feeding butterflies and I'm feeding bees. Borage is really good. Trying to think of what I'm planting. A lot of the things that butterflies like, bees also like. Goldenrod is good because it flowers late. Asters also flower late. What kind of clover did you plant?
I did purple and crimson.
Okay. Crimson is purple, actually.
Well, no, crimson's the darker red, and then the red, I guess it's
Okay.
red, the purple. I guess.
Okay, it's sort of pinkish color, and it's round, whereas the crimson's sort of conical. Okay, the round one, the red clover, that's really pink, bees can't get nectar out of it very well. The crimson clover, bees probably were working about a month ago, and now it's finished. The white clover that you see around is good for bees most of the spring, but it gets really good when the nights get into the 70s. And so if you mow it, it will pop back up before it goes to seed because it wants to make seed, so it's going to make flowers again. And so I encourage people to mow their clover down until it gets warm. I've got some sweet clover this tall right now, and it's just starting to flower. It makes a wonderful honey. Black locust makes a wonderful honey, but that's a tree.
So you said that each brood was dedicated to a crop until it sees itself through whatever is available to them, and that's how you have a single plant type of honey?
Yeah, that's how you get what's called artisanal honeys, but you need to have small supers to put on your hive because plants won't last enough to fill a deeper super. It's nice. I like it, and when I kept bees in France for 5 years, I sold my honey at farmers markets, and the French are very sophisticated on food in general, but on honey especially. They want a specific honey, so you had to have a lot People want to know if it's light or dark. Yes, ma'am.
What is that guy doing?
Oh, that's a very good question. This is in China. They've used so many insecticides there that they've killed the bees. And so there's areas of China that don't have any bees anymore, and he's pollinating. So he's got a cigarette filter, and he's taken some pollen from this tree, and he's dipping it in there and then putting it on flowers.
I have two things. How long do you keep feeding your bees sugar or sugar water?
Okay, that's a complicated question. I don't like to feed my bees as much as possible. I leave a lot of honey for the winter months. Bees will make, especially bees in this environment, in this climate, they'll make extra honey more than what they need. They're not making honey for us. They're making honey for their family and for raising their babies. But as beekeepers, we encourage them to make more than they need, sort of like we do with cows, that we want them to make more milk than they need. And so I leave a lot of honey for them, and then they get through the winter on that. But in the springtime, if I know, for example, in this area, May 1st is normally, before climate change, May 1st is normally when a lot of flowers are going to be available, and the bees could make a lot of honey. But the colony size is small at the end of winter, and then it grows slowly, and then it grows really fast when that honey flow comes. And so when that happens, they use a lot of the honey that they're making to feed babies because they're trying to grow their family. So I stimulate my colonies to make babies earlier so that I have older bees when the nectar flow comes. So 6 weeks prior to May 1st, I would feed my bees to stimulate them to make more brood so that 6 weeks later they have a lot of older bees that can go out foraging.
Okay. And number two, I figured out how bees help us with water. They help the plants, and the plants use photosynthesis, and one of the byproducts is water.
Are you homeschooled? Kids that are homeschooled, they ask the best questions or make the best statements. That's very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
How, if I were to plan to feed the bees or to help them pollinate or something, what would you say would be like the easiest or like the best plant for them or for me to plant?
Probably, I really like borage. And it's hard to find borage. I've had a hard time since I'm here. I've got one variety right now, and somebody's giving me some seeds for some others. Goldenrod is good. Asters are good. Clovers are good. Were you able to get that question? I'm sorry. The question was, what flowers can we grow to help feed bees? Yes, ma'am.
What's the estimated cost to get started in beekeeping?
That's a question with a funny answer for me. I get asked that a lot when I'm teaching beekeeping classes. And if you go to the bee supply store and you buy a new hive and you buy a package of bees or a nuke, you're talking about probably $400 or $500 to get started. And do you know how much you paid?
We wanted something that the kids could do independently.
Uh-huh.
So wildly, ridiculously beyond what is reasonable would be what we spent.
Okay, so you bought a flow hive.
No, we bought a Langstroth long.
Oh, okay.
So that they could lift it themselves with windows that they could inspect.
Okay.
And a wool blanket on top and everything. So for 2 hives.
The other side of my answer and I've told people this a lot, and it happens. The bees, the 3 hives that are on the roof and the bees that are in them were all, well, the hives weren't new. I sanded them and then repainted them, but they were given to me. And the bees in them, 2 of them were nukes that were given to me, nucleus of a colony, that were given to me for the library, and one of them was a swarm that I caught. So the other side of that question, or the other side of the answer, is if you can find a widow that didn't like her husband's hobby, you can get paid to take them away.
Yeah, but where would you find that information?
Okay, I'm going to do my advertisement again. The Northwest Arkansas Beekeepers Association has a swarm list of people that are interested in getting swarms. And so you can get a colony of bees for free. One of our members is the chairman of the swarm committee, and he gets probably 50% of all the swarms in Northwest Arkansas. He gets calls about it. And then he looks on his list to see who's nearby where the swarm is, and he calls them, and if they can't go, he calls the next one. And so swarms are being distributed all the time.
And once you set up a hive, do you have to worry about raccoons or possums?
Yeah, to some extent. But there's tricks to get rid of them, or to keep them away from your hives. For example, this rug around the room, it has little tacks that are facing up against the wall that they stretch the rug to and attach it to those tacks. Put those in front of the hives, the raccoons and skunks don't want to walk on them. Is there another hand? Yeah.
So my motivation for beekeeping is not for the honey. What is there a negative if I decide not to harvest the honey and I just?
The only negative would be if you're not taking care of the bees. Because if you just put bees out there, I call you a bee haver instead of a beekeeper. Beekeepers are actually guardians for the bees. They're almost like parents, and they're taking care of their needs all the time. In exchange, they get more, the bees make more honey than they need, so they get honey. In your case, you would get pollination and the pleasure of having bees, but you still need to take care of them.
So it's important for the colony to be harvesting the honey?
It's not important to be harvesting, but if you're not interested in the honey, you might not go in there as often. So I would be concerned of a bee haver. Now I haven't harvested honey for 2 years, but I started with small. I sold my business that I had in Mountain View, and I was making 12,000 pounds of honey every year. And I sold that business and came here without any bees, and then some people gave me bees. I caught some swarms, and I've just been building those up, so I haven't harvested for a couple years. But they're ready to harvest now. I could, in my backyard, I probably have 200 pounds of honey. Yes?
So varroa mites, how do you detect them, and do you treat for them preemptively?
You need to come to a beekeeping class. Renee, are we going to have beekeeping classes here? Okay, we're going to have beekeeping classes, and what we're doing right now is we're moving a lot away from Bees 101 into Beekeeping 101. So, and we've got 15 more minutes, I believe, and then we need to be done. And there's lots of different ways to detect varroa mites, and they're not difficult to detect them. What's important, and this is integrated pest management, is to know how bad the infestation is. You're going to have varroa mites, but you need to know how bad. And the reason you need to know is that a mosquito in this room, you're not going to tent the whole library to kill one mosquito. And if you did, you know, you would be wasting money, you'd be putting pesticides where you don't need to, and it was for one mosquito. You can do a mechanical control, and it's gone. So what we call them is economic thresholds. At what point do you need to treat for varroa mites? And there's ways of measuring. Yes?
Last spring, there was a brood of bees that populated a catalpa tree cavity.
Mhm.
And I watched it every day, and I wondered while I was watching it what I should be looking for. I was just paying attention, just seeing what I would see. But if you were going to look, if you saw a population of bees moving into an area or existing somewhere, what would you look at? What would you see when you looked at it?
Just looking at the opening of a tree with the bees flying in and out.
What are the things you pay attention to?
I would pay attention to whether they're bringing in pollen, because if they're bringing in pollen, most likely the queen's doing well because the pollen is protein for the brood. If they're not bringing in pollen, then they have a queen problem, most likely. That would be the first thing.
Pollen on their haunches and on their
Yeah,
bodies.
yeah. No, just remember that picture with there's a little basket on their back legs.
The website that you said about using plants, kind of like to keep the bugs away, it was living on,
Living on Earth, I think?
yeah.
Yeah. Has anybody seen that lately? I haven't looked at it to see if it's even exists anymore.
I was trying to, and it brings up an NPR.
Oh, yeah? Other questions?
I have one more.
Yeah.
So now I see these boxes everywhere, when you're driving home, and I'm like, okay, do bees prefer to be out in the sun, or is it better to be actually near shade?
That's a tricky answer too, because until we got that small hive beetle from Africa, it was best to put bees in the sun. I mean, in the shade, because they get too hot in Arkansas. But with the small hive beetle, they like to go into beehives that are in the shade. Partly because when they pupate, when they go into their third stage, they go into the ground and they want the ground to be moist. For the beekeeper, it's better that they're in the shade. For the beetles, it's better that they're in the shade. And for the bees, it's sort of mixed. I like afternoon shade. I worked we've got about 40 hives out at Cobblestone Farms right now where we're raising queens. And I worked out there for 2 hours today, and I couldn't even put my clothes in the hamper. They were too wet. So beekeepers like the shade. Yes?
So in terms of agriculture being a threat to bees, but also it being like a loop system, would you say that, not considering monoculture, which is definitely a negative for bees, if we wanted to track what type of agriculture activities were improving, would you be able to say like row crops versus produce versus like vegetable, fruit, nuts and seeds? Like,
Yeah.
Can you distinguish which one's more important in terms of that agricultural production?
Yeah, I tend to like row crops or truck farming, especially if they're organic. I'm helping out at Dripping Springs Garden right now, setting up hives out there for them. They bought the hives, but I'm helping them learn about them. And the bees out at Cobblestone Farms, which is also an organic farm, they're real happy. And the bees are happy out there too. And they're going to be growing some animals, and they've got clover and stuff out there too.
Is it possible to shadow a beekeeper?
That's another advantage of the bee association. The best thing about an association is you can always find a mentor. Now, I have a lot of people that they want to apprentice with me, and I say, fine, come along and help. And I've had people actually stay at my house for 3 months to learn beekeeping, and was a lot of help. set up my queen breeding program. And she's now a professional beekeeper, on the research end. Yeah, there's always beekeepers. I was talking to a man, he works for the city, but he lives out on Broyles Road, out towards Weddington. And he's got some bees out there, and he says he gets asked a lot. And the biggest problem, and I was talking to him yesterday, is I go in my bees spontaneously, the ones at my house. Now, out at, you know, I'm teaching queen breeding out there, and so I text everybody and say, okay, I'm going to be there at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. But at my house, you know, I might go down there this evening and do something, or tomorrow, but I don't know. So it would be good, you know, if you lived near a beekeeper that could call you and say, you know, I need to do X, Y, Z this weekend or something like that. Most beekeepers aren't like me, that I'm bothering my bees all the time. Most beekeepers will say, you know, every other weekend I'm going to spend an hour or something in my bees. And so, yeah, a lot of people would be glad to mentor. You're going to learn some bad habits, and you're going to learn a lot. Renee?
If we don't have any more questions, could you say when and where the meeting is? You said it was next.
It's next Monday, the 14th, at 7 o'clock at the Washington County Extension Service, which is over the other side of the fairgrounds near the, what's that called? The horse thing out there? Equestrian something, Pauline somebody. I used to teach classes in there. So 7 o'clock next Monday. And it's the second Monday of every month at 7 o'clock. But this will be our first one since the beginning of the pandemic. We've had, I think, 2 or 3 Zoom meetings, but they were difficult. At best. Because part of Thank you.